Have you ever wondered what happens when family becomes your greatest betrayal? This 72-year-old grandmother's story will leave you speechless. Like and subscribe to her light for more incredible life stories that need to be heard. You were born to settle what I owe, not to chase foolish dreams. Those were the exact words my father, Robert Crawford, spoke to me on my 14th birthday. His voice carried no emotion, no hesitation, just cold finality, like a judge delivering a sentence to someone already condemned. The smell of motor oil and rust from his hardware store clung to his clothes, mixing with the stale tobacco that permanently stained his fingers yellow. My name is Margaret Rose. Though most folks in our corner of southeastern Ohio called me Maggie back then, I was born in a cramped 2-room apartment above my father's hardware store in Millfield, a town so small it barely qualified as a dot on any county map. We were nestled between endless cornfields that stretched toward horizons, promising nothing but more of the same endless nothing. Millfield sat in the rolling hills of Athens County, where the Ohio River carved its way through limestone bluffs, and abandoned coal mines dotted the landscape like open wounds. Our main street consisted of exactly 7 buildings: Daddy's Crawford Hardware, Murphy's General Store, Flanagan's Tavern, the post office, Reverend Mackenzie's Baptist Church, Doc Henderson's Clinic, and the Greyhound bus station that saw maybe 3 buses a week heading toward Columbus or Cincinnati. The air in our town always carried the scent of corn pollen in summer and wood smoke in winter. Creek water ran brown with runoff from the old mining operations, and on still nights you could hear the distant whistle of freight trains carrying coal toward the steel mills in Pittsburgh. Most families had lived there for generations, their roots running as deep as the oak trees that lined Maple Street, their lives following patterns set by their grandfathers and great-grandfathers before them. Daddy ran Crawford Hardware with an iron fist and a ledger book that never seemed to balance in anyone's favor but his own. The store smelled like sawdust, fertilizer, and the grease he used on hinges and door locks. Men throughout Athens County respected him because he would extend credit when they were desperate, then use that desperation against them when payments came due. He kept a loaded shotgun behind the counter and a Louisville Slugger beside the cash register, both of which he would use more than once to collect on overdue accounts. Women feared him because they would witness what happened to those who crossed him. His temper was legendary throughout the county. I would seen him grab a customer by the shirt collar and drag him out into the street, over $15 in unpaid bills. I would watch him refuse to sell heating oil to the Kowalski family during a January blizzard because their payment was 3 days late. And me, I lived in constant terror because I never knew which version of him would climb those wooden stairs to our apartment each evening. Would it be the man who whistled while counting the day's receipts, or the one who threw dishes against the wall because his coffee was lukewarm? My mother, Catherine, was like morning mist in our house. Beautiful and gentle, but always threatening to disappear. She had been born Catherine O'Brien in the Irish settlement near Lancaster, Ohio, the daughter of potato farmers who had fled the famine in County Cork. She still carried traces of her grandmother's brogue when she was tired or frightened, her voice lilting with the soft cadence of the old country. Mama moved through our apartment, like she was afraid of disturbing the air itself. She spoke in whispers, walked on her tiptoes, and seemed to shrink a little more each day under the weight of Daddy's expectations. She had gentle hands that would smooth my hair when thunderstorms kept me awake, and she would hum ancient Irish lullabies she would learned from her own mother, Mo Saint R. Mo Char. She would whisper, "My treasure, my heart." Those tender moments were her quiet rebellion against Daddy's harshness. But rebellions in houses built on fear never last long. She worked tirelessly to keep our home spotless, cooking meals that filled our apartment with the aroma of her grandmother's recipes. Irish soda bread, shepherd's pie made with beef from McKinnon's farm, and thick vegetable stews that could stretch $1's worth of ingredients into 3 days of meals. The night Daddy discovered the mason jar of bills Mama had been hiding behind our flour canister, everything changed forever. She would been saving every penny she could find for months, skimping on groceries, mending our clothes with thread salvaged from old garments. darning socks until they were more patch than original fabric, all to accumulate money for my education. When he found that jar tucked behind the blue diamond flower, he threw it across our kitchen, with such violent force that coins scattered like hailstones against our painted wooden floor. The sound echoed through our apartment like gunshots, each coin's metallic ring marking the end of Mama's dreams for my future. He grabbed Mama by her wrist, his thick fingers wrapping around her delicate bones like a vice, dragging her across our linoleum floor while shouting accusations that made our neighbors' lights flicker on one by one down Maple Street. He called her a thief, claimed she was stealing food from his own mouth, said she was betraying her own flesh and blood by hiding money from him. A week later, on a gray March morning when the last snow was melting into muddy rivulets that ran down our street toward Hocking Creek, she was gone from our lives completely, but not before he destroyed her reputation throughout our entire community with lies so vicious they took my breath away. He stood outside Murphy's General Store on a busy Saturday morning when the farmers came to town for supplies, waving a crumpled letter he claimed to have found hidden in her dresser drawer. The paper was yellowed with age and covered in handwriting that looked nothing like Mama's careful script. But nobody questioned its authenticity. He told everyone who would listen that Mama had been carrying on an affair with some traveling insurance salesman for over a year. He said I was living proof of her infidelity, that I wasn't really his daughter at all, just evidence of a cheating wife and her shameful secrets. "This girl is not mine," he announced to the crowd gathered around Murphy's front steps, his voice echoing down Main Street like thunder rolling through the hills. "She is nothing but evidence of a lying woman and her dirty affairs." Not one person in that crowd defended Mama's honor. Not Pastor Mackenzie from our Baptist church, despite all the Sunday dinners she would cook for church fundraisers. Not the neighbors who had known us for years and had watched her hang laundry on Monday mornings and tend her tomato garden behind our building. Not the families who would bought her famous apple pies during harvest festivals and praised her kindness when their own children were sick. They all just stood there with their eyes focused on the wooden planks beneath their feet, their silence somehow louder and more damning than his accusations. The only sounds were the creaking of Murphy's screen door in the March wind and the distant lowing of cattle from Henderson's farm beyond the town limits. Mama never got the chance to defend herself or say goodbye to me. I watched from my bedroom window as she walked away from our building with a single cardboard suitcase held together with twine. Her shoulders bent like she was carrying the weight of every lie he would told about her. She wore her blue wool coat, the one with pearl buttons that she would inherited from her own mother, and her steps were careful and measured, like she was walking through deep water. That was the last time I saw her face for nearly 45 years, though I would spend countless nights dreaming of her gentle hands and the smell of lavender soap that always lingered in her hair. And me. Despite being the supposed proof of her betrayal, I remained behind in that apartment above the hardware store. That is when Harold Brennan entered our lives, like a storm cloud rolling in from the west. Harold owned the largest dairy farm in 3 counties, sprawling across 400 acres of rolling pasture land south of Millfield, near the Jackson County line. His property stretched from the old mining road all the way to Raccoon Creek, where willows dipped their branches into water that ran clear and cold year-round. He was pushing 60, with eyes like muddy pond water after a heavy rain and fingers permanently stained yellow from the cigarettes he chained, smoked from dawn until dusk. Harold's farmhouse was a sprawling white clapboard structure that had been built by his grandfather in the 1890s, complete with a wraparound porch and green shutters that hadn't seen fresh paint in decades. The barn was massive, red with white trim, housing 60 Holstein cows that produced milk for the dairy cooperative in Athens. Behind the barn stood a chicken coop, a pig pen, and several storage buildings filled with hay, feed, and farm equipment. He would been buying supplies on credit from Daddy's store for months, during the lean winter season when his cash flow dwindled. Tools, rope, fence wire, bags of feed for his livestock, and cases of the fresh bread Mama used to bake every Tuesday and Thursday before she disappeared from our lives. Harold would drive into town in his rusty Ford pickup truck every few days, parking directly in front of our store and walking inside with the confidence of a man who owned everything he touched. He always wore the same faded denim overalls over a red flannel shirt, work boots caked with mud and manure, and a John Deere cap pulled low over his weathered forehead. One afternoon in late April, when the Ohio air was thick with pollen and the promise of summer heat, Daddy called me into the back room of our store. The space smelled like dust, metal, and the coffee he kept brewing on a hot plate throughout the day. "Tomorrow morning, you are going with Harold to his farm," he said, never looking up from the accounts book where he was scribbling numbers with a stubby pencil. I blinked in confusion, wiping my hands on the apron I wore while sorting inventory. "Going where? What for?" "To settle what he owes me," Daddy replied flatly, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he had been discussing the weather. I actually laughed out loud, a sound that echoed off the narrow walls lined with shelves of nuts, bolts, and spare parts. I thought it had to be some sort of twisted joke, the kind of cruel humor he sometimes employed when he was in one of his better moods. "You cannot be serious," I said, still smiling, because the alternative was too horrible to consider. That is when he finally looked up from his ledger, and I saw nothing but emptiness in his pale blue eyes. "You were born to settle what I owe, not to chase foolish dreams," he repeated slowly, enunciating each word like he was speaking to someone who didn't understand English. "But I am your daughter," I whispered, my voice breaking like glass hitting stone. He didn't even blink. "No, you are not. You never have been." The next morning, as dawn painted the eastern hills the color of pale honey, he handed me a brown paper bag containing a change of clothes and pushed me into Harold's truck without another word. No embrace, no farewell, no acknowledgement that I had ever meant anything to him beyond the debt I was meant to settle. As the truck pulled away from everything I would ever known, I pressed my face against the passenger window and looked back one last time. Our store, our apartment, the old oak tree Mama used to hang wind chimes on for good luck. All of it disappeared in the dust cloud kicked up by Harold's tires on the unpaved street. I remember thinking, not crying or screaming, just thinking with strange clarity, this is how a young girl becomes invisible to the world. But I wasn't completely invisible. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside my chest, I could still hear the echo of Mama's voice whispering that I was worth more than credit balances and ledger entries, that I wasn't some debt to be erased or mistake to be hidden away. That whisper would eventually save me, though not for many long, difficult years to come. The drive to Harold's dairy farm felt endless, traveling down unpaved county roads that wound through forests of oak, maple, and hickory trees, just beginning to show their spring leaves. Dust swirled behind the truck in thick clouds, coating my throat and making my eyes water. The landscape rolled past, like something from a dream, abandoned farmhouses with sagging roofs, rusted mailboxes leaning at drunken angles, fields where corn stubble from last year's harvest poked through patches of melting snow. I didn't speak during the entire journey, couldn't find words for what was happening to me. Harold never looked in my direction, not once. He just chewed on a wooden toothpick and hummed some tuneless melody, one thick hand gripping the steering wheel while the other rested near a pocket knife attached to his worn leather belt. He smelled like sour milk, old tobacco, and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach clench with instinctive dread. Every time he shifted gears, the truck lurched forward with a grinding sound that seemed to echo my own internal collapse. We passed the old Shawnee burial mounds that dotted the countryside, reminders of the indigenous people who had lived on this land long before white settlers arrived with their plows and cattle. Creek beds wound between the hills like silver ribbons, and I could see the smoke rising from chimneys, in distant hollows where families lived in cabins that had sheltered generations. Harold's dairy farm sat at the edge of what felt like civilization itself, where the county road gave way to a rutted dirt track that led through a gate held closed with rusted chain. A sprawling farmhouse leaned under the weight of its own neglected roof, and dozens of black and white Holstein cows wandered behind wire fencing that looked like it hadn't been repaired in years. The barn was enormous, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, with a weathered sign hanging crookedly above the main door that read Brennan Dairy Est, 1891. Behind the barn stood smaller outbuildings, a chicken coop where Rhode Island Reds pecked at the ground, a pig pen where massive sows wallowed in mud, and several storage sheds that leaned at precarious angles. There was no welcome waiting for me when we arrived. No kind words or explanation of what my life would become. Just Harold's gesture toward the back entrance of the farmhouse, a screen door that hung loose on its hinges and slammed against the frame whenever the wind caught it. "You will sleep in the pantry," he grunted, and that was the extent of our introduction to my new existence. There had been no wedding ceremony, no legal documents signed, no official recognition of any kind, just a business arrangement between two men, my father and Harold, settled with a handshake and unpaid bread bills. I wasn't considered a wife in any legal sense. I wasn't even treated as a servant would be. I was simply property. A transaction completed. The pantry where I was expected to live smelled like spoiled grain, dampness, and something else that made my throat close up with fear. There was a narrow cot that could barely accommodate a child, covered with a threadbare blanket that didn't reach my feet when I lay down. A single small window, clouded with grime, looked out toward the pig pen and the woods beyond. That first night, I remained awake, listening to the sounds of the farm settling into darkness. Cows lowed in the pasture, chickens rustled in their coop, and somewhere in the distance an owl called to its mate with a sound like mourning. But it wasn't the farm animals that terrified me. It was the footsteps, heavy boots on wooden floorboards, moving through the house with deliberate purpose. Every creak sounded like approaching doom. Every small noise made me flinch with anticipation of what was coming. Then they came closer, those measured steps that stopped just outside my door. A long pause filled with the sound of my own heartbeat. Then the retreat of boots back down the hallway. The first night, he didn't enter my space. The second night, he did. I will not describe in detail what occurred in that cramped pantry. I don't want those memories to have more power than they have already stolen from my life, but I will tell you what I felt beyond the physical pain, which was considerable. I felt crushing shame, as if I had somehow earned this treatment through some failure of character or behavior, as if being given away by my father meant I had consented to everything that followed. The weight of that shame was almost worse than the physical violation, because it made me complicit in my own destruction. He never spoke during these encounters, never made eye contact with me afterward. When it was finished, he would toss an old work shirt onto my cot and mutter, "Clean yourself up. Don't stain the floor." Every night after that followed the same horrific pattern. By the end of the first week, I stopped crying because tears seemed to encourage him. By the end of the second week, I stopped counting the days because numbers had become meaningless. He never allowed me beyond the farm's boundary fence, never permitted me to write letters to anyone who might remember I existed. But one day, I discovered a brown paper package hidden beneath my cot, carefully placed there while I was working in the barn. It smelled faintly of lilac soap, the exact scent that had always lingered in Mama's hair. Inside were a pair of soft-hand, knitted socks made from cream-colored wool. They were too large for my feet, as if she would made them for a girl who still had room to grow into something better than what she would become. Wrapped around the socks was a letter, folded carefully, written in the fading ink I remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards. "My precious Maggie, I don't know where they have taken you. I have begged everyone in town to tell me where you are. But Robert is a liar, and this town believes liars more than mothers. Don't believe them when they say you are not mine. I carried you through 9 months of hope and fear to bring you into this world. You are mine in every way that matters. You deserve so much more than whatever they have done to you. You deserve real love, not fear disguised as duty. I am working as a seamstress in Lancaster now, saving every penny I earn. Someday I will find you. Until then, know that you are loved, always and forever." Mama, I held that letter against my chest, like a lifeline, reading it every night before closing my eyes. Not because it made my situation easier to bear, but because it reminded me of something crucial that Harold and Daddy had tried to erase. Someone in this world knew I existed. Someone still believed I mattered, that I was worth searching for. Those hand-knitted socks never touched the floor of that pantry. I wrapped them carefully in an old flour sack and hid them behind a loose board in the wall. I was saving them for the day I would finally walk away from this place, because despite everything, I still believed that day would come. I had to believe it, or I would have died from the inside out. Harold never called me Margaret or Maggie, not once in all the months I lived under his roof. To him, I was simply girl, or sometimes that thing. He was careful never to strike my face, claiming bruises would make him look bad when he attended Sunday services at the Methodist church in town. But he found other ways to hurt me, ways that wouldn't show when he stood in that church pew singing hymns about love and forgiveness. My body didn't belong to me anymore. My time wasn't my own. Even my name felt like something that had been stolen and locked away. He would leave before sunrise every morning to tend his cattle, barking orders as he pulled on his work boots. Have my coffee ready and eggs cooked soft when I return. Don't let them get cold. I cooked his meals on a wood, burning stove that filled the kitchen with heat and smoke. I cleaned his house with lye soap that burned my hands until they cracked and bled. I milked cows in the pre-dawn darkness, their warm breath creating clouds in the cold air, their massive bodies pressing against me as I worked. I mucked out stalls in the barn, shoveling manure into wheelbarrows and hauling it to the fields where it would fertilize next year's hay crop. I washed his filthy clothes in a metal tub behind the house, scrubbing them against a washboard until my knuckles were raw and bleeding. Then, when darkness fell and stars appeared in the Ohio sky, I would brace myself for those heavy, certain footsteps and the voice that would say, "Come here now. Don't make me wait." Every night brought the same terrible script. Every morning brought the same suffocating silence, broken only by the sounds of farm animals and Harold's grunted commands. There was no school for me, no chance to continue the education Mama had sacrificed so much to provide. No visitors ever came to the farm except for the milk truck driver who picked up the daily production, and he never seemed to notice the quiet girl who helped load the metal cans. No mail was ever delivered with my name on it. No neighbors dared question what Harold was doing with a 14-year-old wife who never spoke and never smiled when they encountered us at church or in town. In Millfield, he told people I was a poor orphan from Pennsylvania, a distant relative he would taken in out of Christian charity after losing his first wife to tuberculosis. Most folks looked the other way when they saw us together, focusing on their own concerns, rather than questioning an arrangement that seemed none of their business. The ones who didn't, Harold dealt with them using cold stares and veiled threats that made them reconsider their questions about the quiet girl who lived on his farm. I learned to move like a ghost through that farmhouse, to make myself as small as possible, to hide the best parts of my soul in places so deep that he could never reach them. I stored my memories of Mama's lullabies, the smell of her lilac soap, the feeling of safety I would once known, all locked away in chambers of my heart that remained untouchable. But one February day, when ice covered the water troughs and the wind howled down from Canada, carrying the promise of more snow, I made a mistake that changed everything. I was frying chicken in the cast iron skillet, the same one Mama had used to cook Sunday dinners, when grease popped and burned my hand badly. The sudden pain made me drop the pan, and it crashed against the stove's edge, spilling everything into the fire below. The kitchen filled with thick, choking smoke that burned my eyes and throat. I scrambled to clean up the mess, my hands trembling with fear of what Harold's reaction would be when he discovered what had happened. When he returned from the barn that evening, he didn't ask for explanations or show concern for my burned hand. He simply grabbed my arm with fingers that felt like iron clamps, dragged me outside into the freezing air, and shoved me into the chicken coop. "Maybe sleeping with the chickens will teach you to pay attention to what you are doing," he said, slamming the wooden door shut and securing it with a length of rope. It was the middle of February, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. I curled up in the dirty straw, shivering uncontrollably, trying not to cry loud enough for him to hear through the thin walls. The Rhode Island red hens clucked anxiously around me, their feathers ruffled with distress at having their space invaded. My breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. My fingers went numb with cold, and I could feel frostbite beginning to nip at my toes through my worn shoes. That night, huddled among the chickens with ice forming on the water in their drinking troughs, something inside me cracked, not my spirit, not yet, but the illusion that I couldn't change anything, that I had to accept this existence forever. I wasn't a wife in any real sense. I wasn't even a servant who might earn wages or eventually leave for better employment. I was a slave given a false identity, and I was going to escape this place or die trying. The next morning, he released me without a single word of acknowledgement or apology. I walked straight to my hiding place in the pantry, pulled out the socks Mama had knitted with such love and hope, and traced my fingers over every careful stitch. Then I put them back in their hiding spot. Not yet, I told myself firmly. But soon. That day, I began paying careful attention to everything around me with the focus of someone planning an escape. Which county roads had the most traffic? Which nights did Harold drink himself unconscious on the whiskey he kept hidden in the barn? Where did he keep the keys to his truck? I started hiding small portions of food wrapped in cloth, biscuits, strips of dried beef, apples from the root cellar. I counted his footsteps at night, memorizing the rhythm of his movements through the house. I practiced moving in complete silence, learning which floorboards creaked and which could support my weight without sound. Freedom wouldn't come with screaming or fighting, because I was no match for his size and strength. It would come quietly, like a whisper in the dark. And when that moment finally arrived, I would be ready to seize it. I was 16 when I realized something fundamental had shifted inside my body. It wasn't the familiar fear that had become my constant companion over the past 2 years. It wasn't even the bone, deep sadness that had settled into my chest, like winter fog. This was something entirely different. A gentle pulling sensation, a whisper from somewhere deep within that said with quiet certainty, "You are not alone in this fight anymore." I was pregnant. When I gathered the courage to tell Harold, he just grunted and said, "About time you did something useful around here." Then he spat tobacco juice into the dirt beside the porch steps and went back to cleaning his hunting rifle. That was his entire response. No doctor was called to check on my health or the baby's development. No special care was provided for a girl carrying a child. No concern was shown for someone who was barely more than a child herself. Just more meals to cook on the wood, burning stove, and more laundry to scrub in the metal tub, while my body ached and swelled with new life. My back burned constantly. My feet swelled until I could barely fit into my shoes. And I threw up every morning for months. But for the first time since arriving at the farm, I didn't feel completely empty inside. I started writing letters on anything I could find. Corn husks peeled from cattle feed, old burlap sacks, scraps of paper Harold discarded after reading the livestock prices in the weekly newspaper. I hid them in a rusted coffee can that I buried underneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. Each letter began the same way. "To my baby, if you are reading this, it means I survived long enough to give you these words. I need you to know that you were never a mistake. You were my reason to keep breathing." I named her before she was born, Catherine Rose. After my mother, whose gentle hands I still remembered smoothing my hair during thunderstorms. Though I hated the thought of giving her Harold's last name, I needed the world to have a legal record that she existed, that I had brought her here through sheer determination and love. The night she arrived, in the middle of a March blizzard that howled around the farmhouse like a living thing, the stars seemed especially cruel. The pain doubled me over again and again, waves of agony that made me understand why women sometimes died in childbirth. There was no midwife to help, no doctor to ensure our safety, just a single kerosene lamp for light and my own desperate will to bring this child safely into the world. I lay on the pantry floor, biting down on a piece of cloth so hard I chipped a tooth, determined not to let Harold hear my cries. She entered this world the same way I had lived in it for the past 2 years, unwanted by the man who owned the roof above us, but completely welcomed by the woman who bore her. When I held her for the first time, her tiny body warm against my chest. All I could whisper was, "I see you," over and over again. "I see you, baby girl." Because I had been invisible for so long, treated like I didn't matter, I didn't want her to ever feel that same crushing silence. I wanted her to know from her first breath that she was seen, valued, loved, beyond measure. Harold looked at her once through the pantry doorway, declared she looked weak and probably wouldn't survive the winter, then walked out without holding her or asking about her health. Perfect, I thought to myself. That meant she belonged entirely to me. Life became exponentially harder with a newborn to care for while maintaining all my previous responsibilities. Less sleep, less food, constant worry about her health and safety. My body ached constantly from the physical demands of farm work, combined with nursing a baby. But every sound she made, every tiny gurgle or coo, was like music that no amount of cruelty could silence. When she smiled for the first time, I cried tears of joy so pure they washed away months of accumulated despair. Then the fever came when she was 3 weeks old. Her skin turned burning hot to the touch, like she was on fire from the inside. She wouldn't cry properly, only whimpered like a kitten too small to fight back against whatever illness had invaded her tiny body. I rocked her through the entire night, placing cool cloths on her tiny forehead, singing every lullaby I could remember from my childhood. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I prayed in a voice I didn't recognize, not loudly or desperately, just steadily, like I could will the universe not to take her from me. That was the first night I realized something crucial about my own transformation. I no longer wanted to die because now I had someone worth living for. Catherine and I made a solemn vow that whatever this world had tried to do to me, it would never do to her. She would never sleep in a pantry or storage room. She would never learn to make herself invisible to avoid violence. She would never believe she was debt to be paid off or burden to be endured. And I, his girl, his thing, his nobody, I would become an unbreakable wall between her and every storm, even if building that wall destroyed me completely. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in late October, the kind of autumn day when the air feels heavy with change and even the farm animals seem to sense trouble brewing on the horizon. The maple trees around the farmhouse had turned brilliant red and gold, their leaves falling like confetti whenever the wind stirred through their branches. Harold was in one of his darker moods, the kind that usually preceded several days of particularly cruel treatment. He would been drinking whiskey since noon, celebrating some business deal involving the sale of several head of cattle to a stockyard in Columbus. I would forgotten to bring in his cigarettes from the truck when I returned from milking the evening chores. It was such a small oversight, but in Harold's world, any mistake was grounds for punishment. He slapped the back of my head so hard that stars exploded behind my eyes, and I stumbled forward, nearly dropping the milk pail I was carrying. Catherine, now almost 18 months old, and just beginning to form her first words, clung to my skirt and started screaming in fear. Her cries seemed to enrage Harold even more, like the sound of a child's terror was somehow an affront to his authority. He grabbed my arm roughly, his thick fingers wrapping around my wrist like a steel trap, yanking me toward the porch steps where he often delivered his worst punishments. "You are completely worthless," he spat, raising his hand to strike me again. But his hand never connected with my face. His eyes suddenly rolled back in his head, showing only white, and his legs buckled beneath him like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. Just like that, the devil collapsed, right there on the wooden porch, half leaning against the old railing that groaned under his weight. He fell with a thud that shook the entire structure and sent the chickens squawking in alarm. I froze completely, still holding Catherine against my hip, waiting for him to move, for the familiar growl of anger, for his brutal grip to find my arm again. But there was only silence, except for the wind rustling through the oak trees and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. He was dead. A massive heart attack, the county coroner would later determine after examining the body. Sudden and final, like a period at the end of a particularly violent sentence. I didn't cry or celebrate. I simply sat on the pantry floor that night with Catherine in my arms, rocking her gently while she slept, and whispered, "He cannot hurt us anymore. Baby girl, we are free." But freedom didn't automatically come with his death, because women like me didn't inherit property or gain legal rights simply because the men who owned them stopped breathing. 4 days later, Harold's 3 adult sons appeared at the farm like vultures circling carrion. They were tall men like their father, but with eyes that seemed even colder and more calculating. They arrived in a black Buick sedan with official papers and a lawyer in an expensive wool suit, who refused to make eye contact with me, treating me like I was part of the farm equipment, rather than a human being. "This land was never in your name," the lawyer explained dismissively, shuffling through documents that determined my fate without my input. "There is no record of any legal marriage, so you have no claim to this property." "But I lived here for over 2 years, I protested, my voice stronger than I would expected. "I worked this farm. I took care of everything. I milked the cows. I maintained the equipment. I kept the house running." "You were never legally married to our father," one of the sons interrupted sharply, his tone suggesting that my very presence was an insult to his family's reputation. "There is no documentation of you anywhere in his papers. They gave me exactly 24 hours to gather my belongings and leave the property. I packed what little I could carry. An old wool shawl, a jar of cornmeal, the coffee can containing Mama's letters, and Catherine's birth records, and the hand-knitted socks that represented my only connection to love and hope. I tied Catherine to my back, using cloth torn from a feed sack, creating a makeshift carrier that would allow me to walk long distances while keeping her safe and warm. As I prepared to leave the only home she would ever known, I whispered promises into her tiny ear about the better life we were going to find. As I walked away from that place for the final time, the farmhouse didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked hollow and abandoned, like something evil had died there and something exhausted, but unbroken, had finally been set free. I didn't know where I was going as I walked down that rutted dirt road toward the county highway. I only knew it wasn't backward, toward the past and all its accumulated pain. Every step away from that farm was a battle against the wind and my own fear, but also a victory against the forces that had tried to erase me. My shoes, the ones I had been wearing since leaving my father's house, were worn completely through, but I still had Mama's hand, knitted socks tucked safely in my bundle, and they represented more than warmth for my feet. They represented the possibility of being loved without conditions, of being valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide. I was 21 years old but felt ancient, like I would live through several lifetimes of suffering in just a few years. Yet for the first time since my 14th birthday, I didn't flinch when strangers passed by on the road, because I wasn't running from punishment anymore. I was walking towards something indefinable but real. I didn't know what that something was, but I had Catherine, and I had my real name, and I wasn't going to let the world forget either of us again. I knocked on the side door of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Athens because I had literally nowhere else to turn. Catherine was fussing in my arms, tired and hungry, wrapped in a blanket I would sewn from scraps during our months at the farm. I hadn't eaten in 3 days, and the soles of my shoes had worn completely through, leaving my feet bloody and raw. But I held myself upright despite everything, because being broken doesn't mean being beaten, and I was determined to face whatever came next with dignity intact. The priest who answered my desperate knocking was a gentle man named Father Rodriguez, probably in his 50s, with kind, dark eyes and hands that moved like he was accustomed to offering comfort. He didn't recoil at the sight of me, dirty and trembling with a baby on my hip and desperation written across my face. He took one look at our condition and said simply, "Come inside, child. Let's get you both warm and fed." They provided us with a narrow cot in the church basement, next to the furnace that heated the building during Ohio's brutal winters. For the first time in weeks, I slept without listening for threatening footsteps or fearing what morning might bring. The next day, Father Rodriguez introduced me to someone he thought might be able to help with my situation. "Margaret," he said, I would like you to meet Mr. David Martinez. He is an attorney who specializes in helping people who have been overlooked by the system. I stared in confusion, still not quite believing that help might actually be available. A lawyer? But I don't have any money. The man standing before me appeared to be in his early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes behind wire, rimmed glasses, and a face that radiated competence and compassion. He wore a coat that had seen better days and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had traveled many difficult roads. But what struck me most wasn't his appearance. It was what he said next, extending his hand not to grab or control, but for a proper handshake between equals, Miss Margaret. He said with genuine warmth, "It is an honor to meet you, Miss Margaret. Not girl, not you, not that thing Harold had called me for years. Miss Margaret, spoken like I was a person deserving of respect and recognition." I nearly broke down crying right there in the church basement. David had grown up in New Mexico, the son of migrant workers who had sacrificed everything to send him to law school. He would earned his degree on scholarship, graduated near the top of his class, and returned to Ohio specifically to help people nobody else would represent. The poor, the powerless, the forgotten. He listened patiently as I told my story, not just the parts about Harold and the farm, but everything that came before. My father's lies, the chicken coop punishment, the letter Mama had written that kept me believing I was worth something. He never interrupted once, never looked skeptical or impatient. When I finished speaking, my voice hoarse from sharing secrets I would kept buried for years, he said something that changed everything. "You have every right to file for child support and compensation," he said firmly. "You may not have official marriage papers, but you have witnesses, documentation, and I believe every word you have told me." He helped me file a legal claim against Harold's estate for child support, wrongful displacement, and compensation for unpaid labor. The county clerk looked at us like we would lost our minds when we walked into his office with our paperwork. "You got a marriage certificate?" he asked skeptically, peering at us over his reading glasses, like we were wasting his valuable time. "No," I admitted, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "Then you is not entitled to nothing," he declared flatly, already reaching for the next file on his desk. But David wasn't discouraged by bureaucratic dismissal. Over the following weeks, he gathered testimony from Father Rodriguez, former neighbors who remembered Harold bringing home that young girl from town, even a local midwife who had heard rumors about the situation at the Brennan farm. We stood in the Athens County Courthouse 6 weeks later, an imposing building with high ceilings and marble floors that echoed every footstep. Harold's 3 sons sat in the front row, smug and confident with their arms crossed, clearly expecting this ridiculous proceeding to be dismissed quickly. I stood up in my carefully mended dress, my hands still bearing calluses from farm work, facing the judge without any official papers to prove I belonged in that courtroom. But I had something more powerful than documents. I had dignity and truth. "Your Honor," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "I may not have certificates or official recognition, but I have integrity and lived experience. I scrubbed floors, tended livestock, maintained equipment, and gave birth alone in a storage room. I wasn't his wife on paper, but I lived every single day of the life he forced upon me, and I survived it all without breaking." The courtroom fell completely silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the scratch of the court reporter's pen. The judge looked down at his papers, then back at me with something that might have been respect. "And the child?" he asked, quietly. "Catherine is mine, and she deserves a future built on truth rather than silence," I replied, holding my head high. That afternoon, in a decision that surprised everyone including David, I was awarded full custody of my daughter and a modest settlement from the sale of Harold's livestock, just enough money to rent a small house and begin again. It wasn't everything, but it was something substantial. More importantly, it was the first time I had stood in a room full of men and declared, "I exist and I matter," and they couldn't look away or dismiss me. After the court ruling, David walked me out into the crisp November afternoon. The sky was painted pink and orange with sunset, and the air carried the smell of burning leaves from yards throughout Athens. "You did that all by yourself," he said quietly, genuine admiration in his voice. "I just told the truth," I whispered, still somewhat stunned by what had just occurred. "Sometimes," he said with a gentle smile that reached his eyes, "truth needs someone brave enough to carry it into the light." In that moment, standing on the courthouse steps with my daughter in my arms and money in my pocket, for the first time in my adult life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not complete freedom entirely, but its first, sweet, intoxicating breath. It had been nearly 12 years since I would last heard that name spoken aloud with such venom, Robert. But it came rushing back like bile rising in my throat. Sudden, bitter, impossible to swallow or forget. He walked into our small shop on a gray February morning, wearing that same arrogant expression I remembered from childhood, though the years hadn't been particularly kind to him. Thinner now, grayer, with deep lines carved by guilt and alcohol. But his eyes remained unchanged, cold and calculating as winter pond ice. David and I had opened Margaret's Alterations in a narrow storefront on State Street in Athens, near the Ohio University campus. I hemmed dresses for college girls, repaired jackets for professors, and taught Catherine to sew by hand while she sat on a wooden stool beside my work table. Our shop smelled like fabric and thread, coffee brewing in the back room, and the lilac soap I would finally been able to buy after years of wanting something that reminded me of Mama. Sunlight streamed through our front windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above bolts of cloth. Robert didn't greet me when he entered, just stood with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying our modest success with obvious displeasure. "I heard you made something of yourself," he said finally, his tone suggesting that my survival was somehow an affront to his plans. I didn't respond immediately, just continued pinning a hem on the dress. I was altering for Mrs. Henderson, a professor's wife who would become one of our regular customers. David stepped protectively closer, alert but maintaining his characteristic calm. Robert cleared his throat deliberately, the way he used to before delivering particularly harsh pronouncements during my childhood. "I have come to settle things properly," he announced, "for the family reputation." I laughed then, dry and bitter, as Ohio wind in January. "Family?" He ignored my response, pulling a crumpled document from his coat pocket and placing it on our counter with theatrical ceremony. The papers looked official, complete with raised seals and notary stamps, declaring that I was not legally his daughter. According to the document, I was born from infidelity, a burden he had taken in out of Christian charity before eventually being forced to place me with Harold for my own good. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction, rewriting history to paint himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the perpetrator of cruelty. "If you agree to sign over a portion of your court settlement," he said coldly, "we can put all this unpleasantness behind us. Clean slate, spare the family any further embarrassment." I stared at the document, then directly at him, feeling Catherine's small hand slip into mine as she sensed the tension in the room. "You beat my mother until she couldn't bear to stay," I said steadily. "You lied to everyone who would listen. You sold me like livestock to pay for bread." He didn't even flinch at the accusations. "I raised you when no one else would," he replied. "I fed you, clothed you, gave you shelter. You owe me gratitude, not lawsuits. You threw me away like garbage," I said, my voice growing stronger. David, who had remained silent during this exchange, picked up the fraudulent document. His fingers traced the legal language carefully, and I could see his mind working through the implications. Then he asked politely, "Would you mind if I kept this for review?" Robert shrugged dismissively. "Just don't take too long to decide. The offer will not stand forever." He left our shop like he owned the very street he walked on, trailing the scent of cheap whiskey and unearned arrogance. That night, David stayed up late in our back room, reading through the document by lamplight and cross, referencing it with records from the Athens County Courthouse. 2 days later, he returned to our shop with something remarkable in his hand. "Your mother's handwriting," he said, presenting me with a folded piece of paper, aged soft with time and handling. It was my original birth certificate, the real one that had been filed with the state of Ohio 3 years earlier, Margaret Rose Crawford. It read in bold official ink, "Born to Robert James Crawford and Catherine Mary O'Brien Crawford. Filed, sealed, dated, and completely legitimate. No one ever revoked this document," David explained with satisfaction. "He lied about your parentage, forged evidence to support his lies, and now we can prove it definitively." I sat down carefully, holding the paper like it might crumble in my hands. My real name, not borrowed or stolen or granted as charity. Mine by right of birth and blood. We wrote a detailed letter to the Athens Messenger, the town's weekly newspaper that served all of southeastern Ohio. I composed every word myself, telling them exactly what Robert Crawford had done to his own daughter, how he would sold me to settle a debt, lied about my birth, beaten my mother, forged evidence to brand her an adulteress so he could pursue another woman's money. I signed it with my full legal name, Margaret Rose Crawford, daughter, mother, survivor. The paper published our story on the front page the following week, complete with copies of my birth certificate and Harold's account ledgers showing the debt that had been settled with my life. The town erupted with responses that surprised everyone, including David. Phone calls poured into the newspaper office from women who remembered my mother Catherine, with her gentle voice and generous heart. Men from various churches wrote to say they would always suspected something was wrong with Robert's story about my supposed illegitimacy. Even distant relatives reached out through the newspaper to apologize for believing his lies and to offer whatever support they could provide. The Methodist minister who had presided over my parents' wedding sent a copy of their marriage certificate, further proving that everything Robert had said about my mother was fabricated. Robert never returned to confront us about the newspaper story. Some said he left Athens County entirely, possibly heading west toward Cincinnati or beyond. Others claimed he would fallen ill from shame and humiliation, though I suspected his illness had more to do with increased drinking than guilt. I didn't care what happened to him, because I hadn't struck back with violence or cruelty. I had fought back with truth, documented facts, and the power of community witness. And the entire region heard that truth ring like a church bell on Sunday morning. It was still dark when we left Athens, the kind of pre-dawn darkness that seems to hold its breath, while even the trees lean in to listen. Not a dog barked, not a rooster crowed. The world felt suspended in anticipation, as if waiting to see whether we would really follow through with our plans. The Greyhound bus pulled into the Athens station at exactly 4:15 a.m., its headlights cutting through the February darkness, like twin beacons of possibility. Only 3 passengers boarded that morning, me, David, and Catherine, now 3 years old and wrapped snugly in a quilt I would sewn from fabric scraps during our months building our life in Athens. We had one battered leather suitcase between us, secured with rope because the latches had broken years ago. It contained a few dresses, 2 jars of preserves, the brush Mama had once used on my hair, and a coffee can full of letters that had kept me alive when I wanted to disappear. Everything else we left behind. The shop, the apartment above it, the life we would build in a place that still carried too many painful memories. David paid our fare to Minneapolis, a city in Minnesota where he would been offered a position with a legal aid society that helped immigrant families navigate American law. He helped me up the steep bus steps carrying Catherine when my arms grew tired. He didn't say much during those final moments in Ohio. He didn't need to elaborate on what we both understood. Sometimes you have to leave everything familiar behind to find out who you are meant to become. We found seats near the back of the bus, away from the few other passengers making this pre-dawn journey. I pressed my forehead against the cool window glass, but the seat beside me was warm with promise and possibility. I looked out at the road we were leaving behind one final time. The crooked streetlight that had guided me home during my first months of freedom. The courthouse where I would stood up for myself. The shop where I would learned I could support my daughter with my own hands and skills. I didn't feel anger toward the place that had witnessed so much pain. I didn't feel grief for what I was leaving behind. Only something I couldn't quite name, But that felt like completion, like the final page of a chapter I would never chosen to write. David reached across and placed his hand gently over mine, a gesture of comfort and solidarity rather than possession. "You all right?" he asked softly. I nodded, still watching the shadows of southeastern Ohio roll past our window. "No one's following us," I said with certainty. He smiled gently in the dim light. "They never could have caught us anyway." A few minutes passed in comfortable silence as the bus climbed into the foothills of Appalachia, leaving the flat farmland behind. Then he said something I didn't know I needed to hear. "You are not something that was sold. Margaret, you are someone who chose to walk away from what was hurting you." Those words settled into my chest like warmth on a cold day, because all my life people had labeled me like I was an object rather than a person bargain. Burden, girl, wife, debt to be settled. But now I was something entirely different. A woman in motion, moving toward a future I would help create rather than accept. And motion, I was beginning to understand, is its own kind of freedom. The bus turned a final corner, and southeastern Ohio disappeared completely behind us. No fanfare, no dramatic goodbye, no burning bridges, just silence that belonged entirely to me. And in that silence, I closed my eyes as the first hints of dawn touched the edges of the sky. Not to sleep, but to remember. To remember that frightened girl in the storage room who used to whisper someday to herself and to whisper back to her memory, "You made it, sweetheart. You made it all the way home." We didn't move into a mansion when we reached Minneapolis. There were no celebrations, no fireworks to mark the day we became truly free. Just a small 4-room house with chipped blue paint, a fence that needed repair, and a sewing machine that wheezed when I pressed the pedal too enthusiastically. And that modest beginning was more than enough. David and I settled in the Powderhorn neighborhood of South Minneapolis, far from the cornfields of Ohio, with Catherine still small enough to ride on my shoulders, but old enough to ask why we always seemed to start over in new places. Our new neighborhood was a mixture of working class families, recent immigrants, and young people trying to make their way in the world. The streets were lined with maple trees that would turn brilliant colors each autumn, and the air carried the sense of different cultures cooking traditional foods: German bratwurst, Scandinavian lefse, Mexican tamales. Minneapolis was a revelation after the rural isolation I would known. The city hummed with energy and possibility. Streetcars clanged down busy avenues, factories provided steady employment, and the Mississippi River wound through the heart of everything like a promise of movement and change. We found an empty storefront on Chicago Avenue, in a building that also housed a German bakery, a Jewish tailor, and a family that sold fresh vegetables from their truck. The previous tenant had abandoned the space, leaving behind nothing but dust, spider webs, and the lingering smell of disappointment. We swept out the corners, painted the walls pale yellow, like morning sunlight, and hung a hand-carved wooden sign above the front door: Margaret's Alterations and Fine Sewing. I hemmed dresses for factory workers, repaired coats for streetcar conductors, and created custom garments for women who couldn't afford department store prices but deserved beautiful clothes. Catherine learned to thread needles and sort buttons while sitting on a cushioned stool beside my work table. On Sunday afternoons, we baked bread in our little kitchen behind the shop, filling our home with aromas that reminded me of safety and love. Flour dusted our hair, laughter echoed off the walls, and Catherine learned to knead dough with her small hands guided by mine. She once asked me, while we waited for loaves to rise, "Mama, why don't you ever cry when you talk about the bad times?" I smiled, wiping flour from her cheek with gentle fingers. "Because I used to cry plenty, sweetheart, and now I don't have to anymore." Every evening, after we would close the shop and Catherine was tucked safely in her bed, David would sit by our front window and read poetry aloud. Always poetry, because he said beautiful words helped heal ugly memories. His voice was like smooth river stones, steady and comforting as it filled our home with verses from Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, Robert Frost. Names I would never heard growing up but whose words became part of my daily spiritual nourishment. One snowy evening in January, He paused in his reading and looked directly at me. "I found this in a book at the library," he said, clearing his throat gently. Then he read, "Not a woman broken, but a woman rebuilt. Not ashes and regret, but foundation stones and breath and unbreakable will." I never discovered who wrote those particular lines. I didn't need to know, because all that mattered was that David looked at me when he spoke them, not like I was someone fragile who needed constant protection, but like I was something forged in fire and made stronger by the process. Years passed quietly and peacefully in our Minneapolis home. No newspapers wrote feature stories about our modest success. No statues were erected to commemorate my survival. But I didn't need headlines or public recognition. Every morning I woke up beside a man who never raised his voice in anger, let alone his hand. Every day I watched my daughter grow up completely unafraid of the adults in her life. Every evening I stood in a kitchen that smelled like rising bread and safety. And every night I listened to poetry instead of threats. That, to me, was freedom. No dramatic gestures or grand pronouncements. Just breath. Just light. Just life lived entirely on my own terms. And for the first time in my existence, I didn't have to run toward freedom, because I was already living inside it, building it stronger every day with my own hands and choices. I am 72 years old today, and the hands I use to knead dough are not as steady as they once were. My back carries the persistent ache of years, lived fully and deeply, and my hair has turned the color of winter clouds. But the aroma rising from my kitchen in this small house on the south side of Minneapolis, flour and yeast and warm butter and sweet memory, is as rich and welcoming as it has ever been. I am baking bread for Sunday dinner, the way I have done every week for the past 40 years. Catherine laughs from the front porch as she chases my youngest great-grandchild away from the flower beds she planted along our fence. She is a nurse practitioner now, strong-willed, compassionate, brilliant, just like her grandmother Catherine before her. Her hands know how to heal people who have been broken by life. I like to think I helped teach her that healing was not only possible, but necessary. The kitchen window is open wide, and the April breeze carries the scent of fresh bread to our front yard, where my grandchildren and great-grandchildren play. Minnesota springs are miraculous after the long winters. When the world comes alive again with such intensity, it takes your breath away. One of my great-granddaughters, Emma, 12 years old and sharp as the edge of winter, bounces in through our screen door with pigtails flying and dirt on her school uniform. "Grandma," she says, hopping onto the kitchen stool I painted bright yellow decades ago, "can I ask you something that might be sad?" I turn off the oven timer and wipe my hands clean on the apron Catherine embroidered for me. "Last Christmas, of course, sweetheart." She fidgets with the hem of her plaid school skirt, suddenly serious. "Was it really true? What your father did to you? Like trading you for money?" She says it like the very idea hurts her to imagine, and I am grateful that such cruelty seems impossible to her generation. I nod gently. "Yes," I say softly. "It was true." She looks down at her hands, processing this information. "That is so horrible, Grandma. Aren't you angry about it?" I smile. Not because her question amuses me, but because it doesn't. Because time has given me something infinitely more valuable than anger ever could. I am not angry anymore. I tell her honestly. "Not now." "But why not?" she asks, frowning with genuine confusion. "I would be mad forever." I take her small hand in my weathered one, her young fingers warm against my wrinkled skin. "Because if he hadn't done that terrible thing," I whisper, "I might never have found the strength to leave that place. I might never have met David. I might never have had your grandmother or you, and I might never have learned that freedom tastes exactly like this." I gesture toward the fresh loaves cooling on our counter, their crusts golden brown and perfect smell that, I tell her. She inhales deeply, closing her eyes. Smells like home. It used to smell like shame to me," I explain gently, "like being poor and powerless, like being owned by someone else." She blinks in surprise, trying to imagine bread as anything other than comfort. But now, I say, reaching over to smooth her hair, it smells like me, like where I have been and what I chose to make of my life. She hugs me then, so tightly, I feel it in my bones, and I hold her back like a promise to the future that stretches beyond my own years. Later that evening, our whole family gathers around the dining room table David built with his own hands during our second year in Minneapolis. His photograph hangs above us, a younger version of the man who used to read me poetry under lamplight and call me Miss Margaret when no one else thought I deserved a name. We eat together, passing dishes and sharing stories from our weeks. We laugh together at Catherine's account of a particularly stubborn patient who insisted on diagnosing himself. And nobody calls me girl or debt or burden. Here, in this house, David and I made into a home. I am Grandma. I am the storyteller. I am this family's heartbeat and memory keeper. And though time has weathered my body and silvered my hair, it has not worn down my spirit or diminished my capacity for joy. When the sun sets behind the maple trees that line our street, I sit on our front porch with a blanket across my knees and a book I have read countless times. Catherine brings me tea in the china cup she gave me for my 70th birthday and says, "You have given this family everything, Mom." I shake my head gently, watching fireflies begin to blink in our yard like tiny stars fallen to earth. I just gave them a name to be proud of carrying. Then I look up at the real stars emerging in the darkening sky, not searching anymore, just remembering and smiling, because sometimes survival itself is the greatest victory of all. And I am still here to tell that story, to pass it down like a recipe for resilience. To any granddaughter or great-granddaughter who needs to know that freedom is possible, even when it seems impossible. When I was 14 years old, they said my name didn't matter. They said I was a burden, a body to barter with, a mistake given human form. I was not introduced to people as an individual. I was handed over like property changing ownership. They called me that girl or her, and later simply the help. I remember standing barefoot in a borrowed dress, watching dust swirl behind the truck that had carried my mother away forever. My father didn't even look back when she disappeared from our lives. He only muttered under his breath, "Now we can have some peace and quiet." But I couldn't find peace, not then, because back then, I believed names had to be given to you by other people, that they could just as easily be taken away whenever someone else decided you were no longer worth the trouble of recognition. Now I know better. Now I understand that I am my name, regardless of who acknowledges it. And my name, Margaret Rose Crawford Martinez, is carved into the hearts of every woman who ever thought silence was the only way to survive. I am 72 years old, and this morning, my great-granddaughter Emma brought me wildflowers from our yard, a bouquet of dandelions and violets that most people would call weeds, but that she presented to me like they were precious treasure. She handed them to me and asked, "Grandma, if you were my age right now, what would you do first?" I looked at her, at that light shining in her eyes, that truth glowing in her smile, and said, "Exactly what you are doing. Sweetheart, live like nobody owns you. Live like your voice matters. Live like your dreams are worth fighting for." We sat together under our porch fan, sipping sweet tea from glasses that caught the afternoon sunlight. She braided my thinning gray hair with gentle hands, the same way I once braided Catherine's dark curls, the same way Catherine now braids her own daughter's hair. And Emma asked again, like she had before, "Do you ever feel sad, Grandma, about what happened to you when you were young?" And I told her the complete truth. I used to feel sad, especially when nobody believed it had happened, when people called it just the way things were back then, when I thought surviving wasn't enough if no one knew I had survived or learned from my experience. But now I said, stroking her hair, I am not sad anymore, because every time I tell the truth, another girl realizes she is not alone in the world. Another woman finds the courage to speak up. Another family learns that love doesn't require silence. The stories I once buried in shame have become the soil my family grows in. Catherine, my daughter, and my greatest pride, runs a clinic in North Minneapolis for women who cannot always afford medical care, but always deserve it. Her hands are steady and sure when she examines patients. Her voice is strong and clear when she advocates for women's health. She doesn't flinch when someone cries in her office, because she watched me cry and she learned that tears never make a woman weak. She keeps a framed photograph of David on her desk at the clinic. She says he taught her what love looks like when it is quiet but fierce, when it builds up rather than tears down. And David, oh how I miss that wonderful man who changed everything for Catherine and me. He never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I was. He used to leave little notes in the pockets of my dresses when he helped with laundry. Sometimes just a heart drawn in blue ink. Sometimes just two simple words, "You matter." After he passed away peacefully in his sleep 5 years ago, I found an entire notebook he had been keeping for decades, poems he had written specifically for me, documenting our journey from survival to love to family. Most were simple verses about daily life. Some were barely legible in his careful handwriting, but one I keep folded in my wallet to this day. She was not spared the pain. She was not saved by others. But she walked out on her own strength, so others could be braver. I read those lines whenever I need to remember why I keep speaking up. Why I tell this story even now, when my bones are tired and my voice sometimes cracks with age. Last spring, a young woman came to our neighborhood, drawn by a story about me that had appeared in the Minneapolis newspaper. She knocked on my door with trembling hands and eyes swollen from crying. She said, "I think something similar happened to me. But I don't know how to say it out loud. I don't know if anyone would believe me." I invited her inside without hesitation. I baked bread while she sat at my kitchen table. I let her sit with the truth the same way Father Rodriguez had once let me sit with mine, without pressure or judgment. She cried, and I didn't try to stop her, because the truth doesn't destroy us when we speak it. It reveals who we really are underneath all the lies others have told about us. And we are all braver than the worst things that were ever done to us. The neighborhood that has become my home brings casseroles to my porch when I am feeling under the weather. Our local library named their women's storytelling circle after me, the Margaret Rose Circle. Elderly women gather there every month to share tales they never got the chance to tell when they were young and expected to remain silent. We sit in comfortable chairs and pass the microphone like we are passing a flame from one generation to the next. And I always remind them, you don't have to shout to be heard clearly, but you do have to speak your truth. Because silence protects no one except those who benefit from keeping secrets. I still bake bread every Sunday, the same kind Mama made before silence swallowed her whole. The same kind I once needed with tears streaming down my cheeks, praying my daughter would never taste the bitterness I had known. Now, when the dough rises beneath my hands, I don't think about debts or shame or the price others tried to place on my existence. I think about legacy, about what gets passed down when the world tries to take everything except your will to keep going. My grandsons and great-grandsons call me affectionate nicknames now, Grams, Nana Margaret, the Bread Queen, and I wear every title with joy because they are mine, earned through love rather than fear, given freely rather than demanded through violence. When I walk through our neighborhood, people wave and smile, not because I am famous, but because they know I refuse to break when breaking would have been easier, and even more importantly, because I never let the world decide what I was worth. If you are reading this story now, or hearing these words, or feeling something crack open inside your chest, like an egg releasing new life, please know this. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be fearless. You only need to be yourself, completely, and without apology. Because the day you stop believing the names they tried to force on you is the day you begin to name yourself with love and intention. And when that day comes, I hope you remember me. The girl they tried to sell, who became the woman nobody could ever buy. The voice they tried to silence who learned to sing her own song. If you have ever been labeled undervalued, or called names that weren't truly yours. Remember this: you are not a debt to be paid. You are not a burden to be carried. You are not a mistake to be hidden. You are a story worth telling, a voice worth hearing, a life worth living on your own terms. Subscribe to her light, where voices like Margaret's are no longer silenced. We don't speak to seek revenge against those who hurt us. We speak to declare with joy and defiance. We survived, we thrived, and we still have stories worth telling.